There we go. Good. We're all set. I'll kind of get you people out of my vision here. Well, a lot's been going on with um, the governor's new mandates and allowing certain things to begin happening again. I was excited actually yesterday to be able to go get a haircut, so that was exciting stuff here. It's those kinds of things you don't really appreciate until you can't do it. But since churches have been unable to meet in person for the past several months, I've been attending megachurch. Actually, I've been attending like 3 or 4 different churches every Sunday morning. But I've been attending a megachurch in the Midwest, First Baptist Dallas. They have an amazing ministry that has flourished during the pandemic. In fact, some of the numbers they were coming out with looks like that they have close to 1 million people a week that they are reaching on their what they call their iCampus. And their services, they have spectacular music, great choir, very solid biblical teaching that's Bible based. However, a couple of Sundays ago, their pastor was teaching on a Christian response to the Biden presidency. And while for the most part I agreed with him, there were a couple of things he said relative to a few verses of scripture that I disagreed with him on. And I believe that there is a considerable amount of confusion with Christ followers regarding, first, God's activity in earthly government for government. This pastor made the case that it is God who selects every king, every president, every governor, or every dictator, citing specifically that it was God who installed the likes of Hitler, as well as Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the other Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. And he backed it up with scripture. But the system of kings, governments, and rulers wasn't God's will. In fact, in our pre-Zoom last Friday, Jeff, you were actually kind of talking a little bit about it, and you hit on 1 Samuel chapter 8, and that's what I want to cite today. Okay, and so 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 5 and 7, the elders said to him, to Samuel, "Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Clearly, it was not God's perfect mankind. We should have any other king but him. And he goes on to tell Samuel in the next few verses that there are consequences to having a king, such as having taxes on revenues, income, workers, even family members can be involuntarily conscripted to service of the king. God is warning that each person who is subject to a king is also in danger of losing what we now call civil rights or civil liberties. The framers of the Declaration of Independence had it right when they said that humans are endowed with these rights from their creator. Because he made humankind in his image and after his likeness, that included individual autonomy and liberties that were to be endowed as long as they followed God as their king and recognized his ultimate authority. Now, I mentioned this megachurch pastor who made the case that it is God who selects every king, president, governor, or dictator, citing specifically that it was God who installed the likes of Hitler. He used this verse in Daniel chapter 2 as his proof text. It is he who changes the times and he establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. And so on the surface, this verse seems to say that there is not a government official that has not been placed directly by God, that every king has been personally installed by God and ultimately removed by God with another established. It is a dangerous tack to take a verse out of its context and establish a universal truth that calls into question the very character of God. You see, Psalm 92:15 says, "The Lord is just, he is my rock, there is no evil in him." And 1 Peter 3:12 says, "The face of the Lord is against those who do evil." So if God installs every ruler, and so many rulers are evil, it goes against his character and the biblical witness for him to install so many evil rulers and thus oppress the human race with people that violate his will as to the liberty of those who follow him. So if you read the context of Daniel 2, Daniel is extolling the resume of God that is going to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, Daniel declared in chapter 2, verse 28. So, by the way, don't overlook the fact that the Old Testament is full of God's people subjecting themselves to the rulers of foreign countries and doing so for the glory of God. You know, think about Joseph, think about Daniel, think about, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Ezra, Zerubbabel. I mean, the Old Testament is chock full of people who honored God by subjecting themselves to the foreign rulers. Suffice it to say that the Bible does not categorically state that every ruler is installed by God. And I want you to keep this in mind as we look at Romans 13:1. Romans 13:1 is one of these verses, and one of these first few verses in chapter 13 that seems to cause a lot of confusion among Christ followers. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. See, I think it's important when reading this verse to identify the key words that we tend to overlook. Here they are: subjection, authorities, no authority except from God, and established. We want to take a closer look at this. Joseph Thayer's Greek lexicon has several definitions for the Greek word that we translate subject or subjection. Essentially, while it can represent a top-down order between a superior and a subordinate, when used in a non-military sense, it means a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. Essentially, to cooperate with one another and to cooperate with governing authorities. You know, in Ephesians chapter 5, when it talks about the relationship between Christians, that we are to be in subjection, subject to one another, wives subject to your husbands, husband to wife. It's not the top-down sort of military sense that word is translated. It is in the cooperating sense. Just think if our Christian counseling were to teach subjection as cooperation, the difference that would make in our marriages and make in our homes, even parents and children relationships, if we, instead of having a top-down authoritarian sort of viewpoint to it, have a cooperative viewpoint. You know, no one's going to say don't cooperate with one another, because that's a terrible thing to say. Of course, we learned in kindergarten that we're supposed to work and play well with others. In Romans 13:1, we're to work and play well with the government, okay? The word authorities here means jurisdiction. Cooperate with the jurisdiction of government. Jesus, in his famous "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's," supports this cooperative teaching. Government has jurisdictions, and we are to cooperate with the jurisdictions. It's not talking about individuals, it's talking about jurisdictions. And this clarifies the next sentence. No authority except from God indicates jurisdictional authority, not individual authorities. Here in America, when we take oaths of office, we do so pledging that we will uphold the Constitution, not a political party or a legislator. Again, it is the jurisdiction of government that has been established by God, not the office holder. And this is what is meant by the word established, meaning assigned. It is, so those which are assigned by God. So it's not God is not the author of confusion. And so keeping this in mind, let's look at another verse that we use all the time in confusion with our role and government's role, and that's in 1 Peter chapter 2. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Cooperate with institutions, whether a king, governor, mayor, etc. Why? And this is really important. In fact, it is the crux to understanding how we as Christians are to engage in the public arenas. These jurisdictions are established by God for us, look at this in verse 14, for the punishment of evildoers and praise of those who do right. The Bible is very clear as to the why of God's establishment of authority and jurisdiction, even amongst the unsaved. God's purpose for government is to punish evil and to praise good. That's the purpose for government. And it sounds pretty simplistic, but the more we search the biblical witness, the more we discover that God was the very first proponent of what has become a quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson, that government is best which governs least, because its people disciple themselves. The people discipline themselves. I think Jefferson's opinion has a solid biblical base. Look again here at Romans chapter 13. For it, authority or government, is a minister of God, a messenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. You see, we've misread this verse and mistaught it for so long for it to say that every president, every dictator, every mayor, every city council person is a minister of God. That's not what this is saying. It is government, it is the authority that has been established by God that is the minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Punish evil, praise good. So just how does this work? Romans 12:17 through 19 tells the believer to, quote, never pay back evil for evil, and, quote, never take your own revenge. It's not that God is telling us to forget or to ignore injustice. God will exercise his vengeance now or later, and the government is one of those tools for doing this. To borrow a term theory, the government is filling a negative role when it punishes evil. This role involves punishing bad behavior in order to protect citizens in their pursuit of something legitimate. For example, by punishing evil, the government is protecting a citizen's own pursuit of private property, of health, and life. In contrast, government plays a positive role when it directly provides something to its citizens, like infrastructure, reasonable programs for the disenfranchised, safety measures, things of that. Those are positive roles that government takes. Romans 13:3 mentions the government's positive role. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. You want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. You will have praise from this authority. Note again that the passage does not call the government to play a positive role by creating rights or goods or services, but to give praise to those who actively do good, the ones creating the goods and the services. And this praise could be giving special recognition to those who are serving in exemplary ways, or just acknowledgement, official or otherwise, for being a good citizen. John Murray, in his commentary on the book of Romans, writes that the praise could be expressed by saying that Good behavior secures good standing in the state, a status to be cherished and cultivated. Now, this passage does not prohibit government from providing goods and services, but strongly puts the emphasis on upholding the rule of law and encouraging good behavior. Okay? Government's main job is to uphold the rule of law and encourage good behavior. So let's take another fresh look then at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Submit yourself to the Lord for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, the praise of those who do right. Note again that this summary of government's role gives primacy to the rule of law or punishing evil. Government is also to give praise to those who do right, rather than doing the good itself. Did you ever wonder why the majority of hospitals, we're talking about St. Jude, right? The majority of hospitals are named for churches or religious people? Because it was the community of faith who took the lead in providing care and building the hospitals and providing health care for those who are in need. Because it was the community of faith who took the lead, doing good. In short, the biblical purpose of government is to punish evildoers that would hinder its citizens from doing right in their personal pursuits. Think about even the Old Testament theocratic system. Some will even call it a theocentric system that God installed prior to acquiescing to the Hebrews and installing a monarchy. The judges and priests were in place to guide the citizens in the pursuit of the good. The priests were there to facilitate the sacrifices for sins committed, the evil, so that every citizen could once again pursue the good unhindered by being clean before God. So this whole issue of authority and submission leaves us in quite the conundrum. Is the Bible telling us that we are to stand idly by when we see the government or any of its leaders acting in ways that we believe are not in the best interests of its citizens? Is political activism an act of non-cooperation with the authority? And if so, is that not allowed based on the biblical witness? So let's once again take a look at the example of Jesus here. Jesus said to them, whose doctrine is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. This was the very first theory of limited government in the history of the world. Give Caesar the money because it's his money. He printed it. But don't give him the allegiance. What Jesus Christ is saying is that you may give Caesar some of what he wants, which is his money, but you cannot give Caesar ultimately what he wants, which is to completely accept his system of coercion, his system of injustice, his system of exclusion. We can't give him that. When standing before Pilate in John 19:11, Jesus acknowledged Pilate's authority over him, but he said, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. Now, this isn't that God ordained Pilate. This is that God ordained the system that brought about Pilate. And it happened to be that this was Pilate in the role at the time when Jesus was there. It's an amazing thing when you actually realize that God isn't necessarily on a chessboard orchestrating every single thing that happens in the world. And it's still amazing that he knows everything that's going to happen and that it all happens according to his time. That's the real miracle here. See, the Apostle Paul again speaks of this in his letter to Timothy. I urge that prayers be made for kings and all who are in authority in order that they may live a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. You know what God's will is for mankind? It is that we may live a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. That's what he wants for us. That's why he created us. That was what it was in the garden. Note that the prayers are for the secular authorities to provide a rule of law so that there might be safety and security. I was researching Bible scholar J.P. Moreland, and he said that this passage calls for prayers to, quote, sustain stable social order in which people can live peacefully and quietly without fear of harm, end quote. Hang on, I went to two places here. That's okay, you're going to see this in a moment. So this passage in Matthew 22 and the ones that we've been reading in Peter, they are so important because they set forth the New Testament perspective towards secular government. The Old Testament had established a theocracy where Israelite kings were expected to adhere to the Old Testament law. Today, however, most people live in societies that are more similar to the pagan nations identified in Amos 1 and 2 than they are to Israel. It can be argued that the biblical laws for Israel are more applicable to the modern day church than to the secular government. To wit, the prophet chastises these pagan notions and rulers for violating people's negative rights. You know, the forced deportation of a population, the torturing, the killing of pregnant women, all these things that we see from Amos in Amos 1 and 2. This table of the prophets and their understanding of the responsibility of pagan rulers and nations. While none of these New Testament passages support one form of government or another, they do imply that government's primary role is negative, not positive, focus more on punishing evil and praising good behavior and less on providing goods and services. So with that in mind, the larger question is still before us, and that question is, how should Christians engage? Steve, if you can unmute people, I'd like to open it up to see if there are any questions or comments.
We can't unmute everybody. Everybody has to unmute themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that's more of the positive part of that.
Well, Jay, I have a quick question, just point of understanding. Do you make a distinction between God's permissive will and his decretive will?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I just used that word because I thought it was seriously because I thought it was familiar. I do not believe in the theory of a perfect will and a permissive will.
Okay.
I believe that God's will is either done or not done.
All right, that clarifies some things. There's a lot of questions that are, I mean, you mentioned it at the beginning. This is a very, very controversial subject.
It is.
So I don't want to get into a lot of questions here because it would just, muddy the waters and it would take too long. I love what Chris Ward said about government. The role of government is to prepare for the second coming of Christ. What's your thought on that?
I would like to see the basis for his statement.
I think the basis for his statement is that Christ is coming at an appointed time, and based on God's sovereignty, he's causing all the events of the world to occur in such a way that when the time is right, Christ will return. When the maximum number of people that Christ has elected to his kingdom will actually come into his kingdom.
Okay, now you have kind of ventured into almost two different types of things. So the one thing I would like to have you ponder, I'm not saying you're right or wrong or anything like that. Ponder that God is not necessarily orchestrating everything to get to that, but that because he is not only sovereign, but omnipotent and all of that sort of thing, that it is in motion. And then the other thing is at his appointed time. See, you mentioned his appointed time, and then you said at that time when X number of people or whatever all of his criteria is met. And that's a theory that I have. I'm still exploring it, but you know, there's the verse Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time God sent forth his son, born of a
Right.
woman, born under the law. The fullness there is the fullness like a cargo ship back in ancient days, is that ships wouldn't sail according to a schedule, but they would sail according to when they were full enough that it made the voyage profitable. And I believe that that no man knows the day or the hour, partially because there will be a time when God says, now, done, we're full, ready to go. And that's when that will happen. And whether, you know, and I'm sure because God is, you know, the smartest guy in the room, obviously, that he already knows when that is just because he's so smart. But I think he knows where all of that is without necessarily orchestrating that, you know, without necessarily orchestrating that. So I agree with you, but I almost agree with you for a different reason, but we came to the same conclusion from a different path.
Yeah, well, I have a lot more questions, but I want to leave others to ask questions as well. So
I wanted to talk about this Romans passage 13, first several words, which are very, very, seems like very clear the way it comes through. I would like to think like Paul, who was in prison writing this, seems like he's of a mind saying that give to God is appointed by, kings and queens are appointed by God, kind of a mindset. And I don't know, I hope it's not right, but I just kind of think that that's been a very difficult passage to really, we were studying it in our Bible study, and it goes on and on for about few words, a few of the first several verses. Seems to keep going, keep at it. So
yeah, I can appreciate that. I think the thing that we have to be aware of is that there's a lot of, I understand that in order to get to this point where you're looking at systems and not necessarily individuals, that it's going to take a lot of deprogramming to accept that, because we have been programmed. I've certainly done it. It's certainly out there right now. Particularly, it is very common in the Bible teaching realm to look at something on its face, not consider the context, and not really dig in to see what the words mean. And so that's why, you know, you are going to hear certainly teachers that are more highly regarded than I am, you know, and smarter than I am, and have a lot more letters behind their names than I do, who are going to do what I call, you know, possibly sloppy exegesis. And that is just taking what it says, moving on, and building a theology around it. And then subsequently they do eisegesis, which is they take other texts to prove right the theory that they already came up with. And you have to be courageous enough to actually look at this and say, maybe I'm not, maybe there is a difference. See, here's what where I approach this, and that is, I believe above and beyond everything, when interpreting scripture, we have to remember that God is not going to do things that are counter to his character. And so anytime that there is something that is counter to his character, either God's a liar, or we've got it wrong and we're not interpreting it correctly. And so, you know, when somebody says that God put in Hitler, I think that is just absolutely as close to blasphemy as you can get. Because now, is the system of authority one that God put in? Yes. But then you have to realize that those authorities are run by people who are not, God followers. So the Germans of the early 20th century were essentially the same as the Amalekites and the Hittites and all of those. And so God did not install Hitler to do that. It was not God's will that 6 million Jews and probably at least 6 million Christians were exterminated in the middle of the 20th century. That was categorically not his will. And it wasn't his system, and it wasn't his purpose for government. Now, given that all of those things happened and God is still able to continue in his will and his work and move toward the second coming, is a testimony about the amazing power of God that powers over evil. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this next week, but that's, so if you can keep in mind, at least be open to the idea that the governing authorities and what it says in 1 Peter, that the human institutions, governing institutions, are set up as God's pattern. And you can even see this in the pattern of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, through priests and judges and things like that. Their role was it really didn't matter who the person was. It was the fact that they were there to facilitate people getting closer to God by accepting those sacrifices. They were not there necessarily to distribute good. They were there to defeat evil.
Hey, Jay.
Yeah.
Well, we know that God particularly chose King David for the role of leading Israel, his chosen people. Do you recall, or anybody else recall, how Saul was chosen? Was it the people that chose Saul?
Yes, it was the people who chose Saul. If you read through 1 Samuel, you see how Saul kind of ascended to that. Ultimately, he did enough things that he became more recognized, and and he was taller and handsome and talented. He was charismatic, and so he became the choice by acclamation of the people. And so, when it came to David and Samuel being involved, remember it was a case of the people that God had said, look, they haven't rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me. Doesn't mean that so God is willing to work within the framework, realizing that it's not his will, but that we're still his people. I think that there is lots of evidence, both biblical and personal, where God has worked in our lives, even if we were not exactly doing what was his desires for ourselves. How many times have you seen protections for yourselves or your family when he shouldn't have been protected, but he was there to protect and to guide,
Well, I want to throw one in here. I've never heard anybody else use during discussions like this. But if you go to Matthew 4:8, and I'll read it to you since I didn't have time to develop a PowerPoint. Again, the devil took him being Jesus, to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. Does that not imply that Satan has the power to pick whoever's going to rule these kingdoms?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. His spirit is, I won't say his spirit, his, the result of Satan's influence that began in the garden has become systemic. And so, you know, and even Paul recognizes and calls Satan the god of this world, you know, little g.
Also,
So
this,
is his influence that has become systemic through, you know, what, at least 7,500 years of recorded history, you know, is that a cause for that? Could you say that Satan is the god of this world? Yeah. Then I'd also like to just sort of point out that I don't usually point to Satan as being always on the up and up the way he categorizes things, you know. And so if he's trying to snow Jesus,
Oh, he might have been lying. Okay, I see.
Jay,
Yes.
going along with what Jeff just said, in 2 Corinthians 4, 4, in whose case the God of this world, little g, has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, to his image of God. Reason being is that when Dick and I talked about Biden and the vice president going to the Catholic Church, you know, was it all for show, or was the little God, Satan, just, you know, got the blinders on these people? I don't know, and I don't pretend to know, but anyway.
Yeah, you know, that again, that's interesting. But when you read that, you know, Satan has blinded the eyes. Yeah, but is it a case where there's every person who's born that Satan actively is doing that? No, systemically we have more and more as a human race become more. We call it secularization. So if you looked at secularization as being the fruits of Satan's influence, then I think you kind of get more of an idea. Satan has blinded the eyes. Yeah, he sure has, but it has become systemic since the Garden of Eden. You know, and so as Satan's influence begets more of Satan's influence, you know, some people will call it the Adamic nature and that sort of thing. There, you know, that I think is what we see as blinding the eyes, you know, which makes it so hard for us to see God, because we're so blinded by this. You know, the prophet Amos writes about God's punishments on upon these secular governments, and he does it because they have facilitated and punished those who were doing right. Amos speaks of, you know, nations that are, you know, deporting people and capturing people, murders, abortions, and other violations of God-given inalienable rights. And he addresses their motives of greed and imperialism and expansion at the expense of the very people that a government is purposed to protect. In America, we face issues of systemic bias right now. I mean, this is all we're talking about. You know, racial bias, gender bias, economic bias. And yet the government not only turns a blind eye to its taxpayer support of abortion, but expands its ability to, as Amos 1:13 says, rip open the pregnant woman. And in California, we see Governor Newsom and the legislatures through fiat closing houses of worship, banning forms of worship like singing, unilaterally closing down small businesses. And we also see a groundswell of support for recalling the governor. And we see that churches defying orders and remaining open. We see businesses staying open and suffering the consequences. We see churches taking the government to court. But is this the biblical way for Christians to engage? The question is any form of activism wrong? And is there a biblical line that shouldn't be crossed? So when we look at Romans 13:4 again, thinking about it in this way, I'll get back to it. Okay, I'll get there in just a moment.
you had it.
Okay, there we go. So, you know, we look at, so the question is, if we are to engage But is it okay for a church to stay open when the government says to close? Is it okay to take the government to court? So read this, guys, okay? Government is a minister of God to you for good, but if you do what is evil, be afraid. Okay, read this carefully. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister, authority, government is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath to one who practices evil. Where does the Bible draw the line for Christians to engage as agents of change in society or in government and in politics?
Are you asking that question for us?
I'm asking that question.
Okay, it's an Acts. It's when the disciples were told to stop preaching Christ. And
But they
said,
continued anyway. So why wasn't that a sin?
because God first, government
Okay,
second.
so look at Romans 13:4, because the answer is this. Where does the Bible teach us to draw the line in our activism?
I think Jesus, when he said, give to the government what's government and the rest of the world is, or this.
I agree with
God
you.
every other way.
I agree with you. Take a look at Romans 13:4. It's on your screen, right?
I'm looking.
Okay. Where is the line?
People doing evil.
Evil.
When it's
There
not-
you go. It is where we cross the line from activism to evil.
Right.
Not just what humans say is evil, but what God says is evil. And that, so why wasn't it a sin when Jesus got angry and overturned the money changers' tables in the temple? Because his actions were not evil. Why was it not a sin for Peter and John to continue to preach even after being imprisoned for preaching? Because their actions weren't evil. Check the line. So why is it okay to support President Trump and his bid to have recounts, but not support the violence of storming the Capitol? Because recounting the votes isn't evil, but violence is.
Yes.
Check the line.
Perfect. Okay, excellent.
So Jim Sando, why is it okay to work toward recalling the governor, but not okay to destroy the governor's mansion? It comes down to evil. We need to check the line. It is our duty to protest and to work toward the elimination of abortion, but it is evil to bomb clinics and murder doctors.
Yeah, I want to only talk about recall since I was involved with one. And we did recall people. And the answer is that is a function of government. The government laws set up the ability for the people to recall. So that was actually built into the government authority to have recalls.
Exactly. And so, so the question that is facing a lot of Christians with a conscience is, if I am supposed to cooperate with the authority, with the government, if that's where peace and harmony lies, then am I supposed to just stand on the sidelines for the next 4 years while the government turns into the abortion capital of the world? The answer is no. Activism is perfectly okay with God. It is, in fact, he wants Christians to be engaged in society. The line is when that goes from activism to evil. The riots of 2020 and the riots of January 6th were all wrong. And they were sinful for Christians to engage in because they were evil. If you want to know where the Bible stands as for activism and engagement in our governments and in culture, then we check the line.
Jay, this is Larry. This is a real simple illustration, but I'm a conservative Christian. Okay, the election didn't go the way I wanted it to go, but here's the illustration. We were driving down Imperial the other day, and there's a little vendor that has a little booth set up on the sidewalk selling T-shirts, and the front of the T-shirt says F Biden. Use the other letters with the F. To me, as much as I'm disappointed in the way the election went, that's an abomination. And that is evil activism. And you know, that's in its most simplistic form, but that just totally, I mean, I was so disgusted when I saw that I just almost couldn't sleep that night.
Yeah, you know, the flag that I saw from pictures on January 6th, you know, Jesus saves, while they're storming and committing acts of violence. I tell you, it was that was evil.
Tears my heart out. It's absolute evil, and it communicates a whole different message to the world that we're trying to save.
Yep.
I think
Exactly.
the principle here is quite simple. It's you submit to governing authorities until they violate the word of God. As soon as they violate the word of God, you don't submit.
Well,
Now,
I think that
the difficulty with that is you have to really know God's word thoroughly in order to know what his will is.
Right.
So that requires a great deal of study and understanding of exactly what God's will is, because you don't want to violate God's will. And so when you see that T-shirt, like Larry said, that's a violation of God's character, his nature. And so it disgusted him, because that was not God's will to act that way, even towards those we disagree with. Christ said to love our enemies, so that's not a loving statement toward our enemies. So it violates that principle.
Brett, I think you've hit it on the head. It is, I think for us, it is a very simple thing to understand that at the point where our activism or our involvement or our engagement crosses the line into evil, that's where it becomes wrong. That's where we stop cooperating and we begin acts of evil.
So I agree, Jay, this is wonderful insight. And I think what my brother Glenn just said, I don't agree with him. And I want to see what you think about, I think there's go back to the positive actions of government and the negative actions. I agree with negative, but I was in a discussion with, I think a Democrat, and we're looking at the Bible, and he's looking at how Jesus healed everybody. And pretty much the idea was, how can we not have universal health care? And my response was, yeah, sure, go ahead and say government provide health care. But that doesn't mean we get government provided health care. We all get a free pass to Disneyland. And what goes on at Disneyland, it's overcrowded, it's awful, we hate it. And so just because government says, okay, we're going to give everybody health care, doesn't mean we get it. And it isn't the best way to deliver it. So that's a debate I think is worth having. I agree with, you never want to commit evil, but I don't think that's a sin for government to provide health care. I think it's just inefficient, and and not the way to do it. So I think
that, and let's take that a step further, Jeff. Before government did get involved in providing health care, okay, we had Christians, people of faith. You know, that's why there is a St. Jude's and a St. Joseph, and, you know, Baylor University, the Baptist, you know, all of these hospitals and healthcare systems that were developed by the faith community, because that was the good that came, because government allowed us to, you know, government facilitated the actions of the good to do this. Now, in the absence of that, government has stepped in, but certainly, as you know, as we see in the Bible, it is not the role and the purpose of government to do those things. It is the faith community that is supposed to be doing these things.
Yes.
Explain to me why so many Christian pastors, and maybe you're going to disagree with my premise, but it seems to me that so many Christian pastors will not engage in any way, shape, or form in any sort of political action. To me, that strikes me as non-scriptural, that they are called to engage in in our society, and yet they refuse to.
I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding when government established in the Bill of Rights that it would not establish religion, and then we have bought into this false notion of separation of church and state. And I think that through generations now of being taught that there's a separation of church and state, and then you add the other caveat, and I hate to be cynical about it, but let's just put it on the table there. They're afraid of losing their tax exempt status, and they're losing their giving.
Exactly.
And then, here's the other thing. We've had, 2 generations, 3 if you count a generation as 15 years. 3 generations now of people coming up in a more secularized system, even pastors, training and things like that, to where they just don't get involved.
Pastor Jay, I don't listen to the news very much, but the one thing that warmed my heart was South Carolina Senate passes fetal heartbeat. I thought that was phenomenal, that God is working in behind the scenes in government, to say, hey, this abortion thing is wrong. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, you know what? And I think that those are the types of things that we need, we need to understand that our activism can lead to positive actions by our government. Now, so you look at that, and even though that is a positive action, that is a negative action on the part of the government. It is negating evil, protecting the unborn from evil. That's what government is supposed to do.
One of the other things I think about engaging is not just activism in a being demonstrating or opposing, but actually joining in and becoming part of the government and legislature and running for office and doing that. That's activism.
I agree. One of the greatest thrills of my ministerial career was being able to swear in a city council member in the city of Irvine who had been a girl that I had was in my youth group when I was a youth minister in Santa Ana in the early 1980s. And she had taken her Christian faith, and she was a strong activist for Christ and a Christ follower, and she got elected. She was the mayor pro tem of the city of Irvine. And so, yeah, these things are fabulous when they work the way when they work according to God's purpose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Jay, I don't know if you're going to address this next week, but that would be really, really fantastic to have a talk on Christian activism and, what are the principles behind that and what should we do, what should we not do, and that sort of thing. So, because there's a lot of confusion about how much Christians should be involved in government and whether churches should, stand up for government policies and things like this, or fight against government policies.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think the step before that, which is what we're going to address next week, is the fact that we are losing the battle against evil.
Right.
And we need to understand why that's happening and what can be done about it. What Christians need to understand about our DNA that is programmed, that is causing us to lose the battle against evil. We know where the line is now, and the line is don't do evil. We also need to fully understand why we seem to be so powerless to stop it. And so next week we'll examine this losing battle against evil and what we can do. And so, we may get into activism. There'll be some good time for discussion on that. But we need to understand our DNA, and then maybe that puts that in perspective.
Jay,
The problem, Jay, Jay, the problem,
Larry,
one problem, Jay, one problem I see is that, there's been a lot of talk about how Christians are intolerant and, they don't care for the people. And we've kind of become very passive. And we, the other side is very passionate about what they think is right. And most of the Christians, I think, and then Republicans in general, tend to be very passive. They don't really voice their opinion. In fact, that they kind of sort of like invisible in terms of what they believe. If we say what we believe, that can be objectionable or difficult for the other person. So talk about activism is one thing, but even in our normal life, we never say we believe in this to somebody we do not know. And even with the people we know, if one is of the other mindset, it just comes through as very clearly that you're intolerant, you don't understand, kind of a thing. So I see a lot of pessimism within the Christians, even though they believe what's right, they don't voice their opinion.
Well, I think it's important for us to understand that evil, and this line between activism and evil, it's what God considers evil, not what people consider to be evil. Because people who disagree with us consider us to be evil, and unfortunately, people with whom we disagree, we consider them to be evil. That's not it. Jesus can go and turn over the money changers' tables, and that's not evil. But we would consider that to be evil, and we would consider, and if we did it, we would be considered to be evil. It's midnight in the garden of good and evil here, guys, and we have to understand that we have a lot more authority, let's say permission, let's put it that way, from God to be active, as long as our actions don't cross the line into evil.
John MacArthur said that if he had been a pastor back in 1776, he would not have supported pursuit of independence for America.
Right, and see, and I think that's where, and I love John MacArthur, but some of his stuff, it's like he gets sloppy in his exegesis.
Okay, well, I didn't say I agreed. I just threw that out there.
But so the question is, can you oppose the government without evil? Can you be a revolutionary and it not go into evil? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Jay, I got a comment. Anytime you form a group of people and I'm talking about a country, a state, or even a little hot rod club like I was in when I was a kid, they set up boundaries and rules to maximize the ability of this group to get along. Okay? What happens is the corruption starts with a single individual and builds from there. And so they've taken what is basically good in order for everybody to be compatible, and starting with one individual and another individual, it eventually corrupts the whole thing, and what was intended to be good falls apart like a house of cards. And so our battle is against evil.
Yes, exactly.
That's what it is. It's simple, cut and dried, and very clear to me.
And the problem is we seem to be so powerless against it, and we don't understand why. And that's what we're going to look at next week.
Great. Good stuff.